Hey, welcome to Ryan Flies. In this episode, probably my most requested one ever, a deep dive into wiring your own avionics. As promised, this is a fully transparent look at the process, challenges, and costs associated with wiring your own avionics, as opposed to having a professional either create a plan or create a plan and do the wiring for you, a choice that many builders are choosing to do. For me, there was never a question. Wiring my own avionics is absolutely something I wanted to learn how to do. I'm a nerd and I have nothing but time. Many of you are intimidated by the idea of wiring your own avionics. However, the potential cost savings is alluring, and so you have probably loads of questions that I aim to answer in this episode. I cannot ultimately decide for you, but hopefully what I can do is present to you a lot of the things I learned. Again, a transparent look at the costs associated with it, some of the pitfalls, and help you make that decision on your own. What we won't look at in this episode are some of the platform choices I made. We're not going to get into Dynon versus Garmin, and we're not going to get into IFR versus VFR, or any of the other things that have been endlessly discussed on forums. If you want to learn more about those decisions and some of the criteria there, I suggest hitting up some websites. Because of that, we're going to treat some of the decisions I've made as constants. For example, I chose a dual screen IFR light system from Garmin. Again, we won't weigh any of the pros and cons of this. We'll just treat this cost as a constant when we tally up the total, and you can keep in mind whether you feel you know a way to save some money over the choices I made. Again, in the interest of full transparency, I will let you know that for my Garmin boxes and the connectors associated with them and all of the antennas, I paid roughly $35,000. I was a little south of that, but I think if we want to plan adequately and take into account things like shipping, it's a good ballpark number to say if you want a panel similar to mine, you're going to start with that cost as your base cost. And with that, we're going to start our running total on what this thing cost me. Now, while I was quoting the Garmin system, several outfits provided me with their cost to do the wiring for me. The services offered ranged anywhere from simply doing a wiring diagram and some of the panel planning, all the way up to fully wiring the panel, providing a powder-coated, labeled panel with my avionics installed that I would simply pop into my plane. There are caveats to all of this services done for you. They cannot do everything, and we're going to get into a little bit of that later on. However, I will say that on the very low end, having somebody plan your panel and simply provide you a very thorough wiring diagram that can act as a guide to wiring your own harness typically runs anywhere from $1,500 to $2,500 from what I've seen. And I think if you're intimidated by the idea of drawing this diagram yourself, that is money well spent. If you want to hire them to handle the physical wiring, providing all the wiring connectors, terminals, all of that, the whole enchilada, I got quotes that ranged anywhere from $8,000 to $12,000. That is in addition to the core components, and is a base fee that can go up if you choose to do extras or have them take the harness further than what they've quoted. And we'll get into, again, some of the things that are not quoted in that in a little bit. Now, as I mentioned, the planning was absolutely something I wanted to do from the get-go, and so I started out by drawing a diagram. This was earlier last year, actually, early 2024. It feels weird to say that. But I sat down and I started drawing boxes on the computer. For me, I use a program called Adobe Illustrator, something that I have a lot of experience with. I have it on my computer. It was a very easy choice. For others, it might not be quite so easy. It does come at a cost and a small learning curve. And so I have heard of folks using anything from PowerPoint to Microsoft Word to SketchUp and others to draw their own diagrams. I pulled from a lot of things that I saw on the internet, including some diagrams that people had provided from other avionics companies, as well as ones that they had drawn themselves. Through this and reading the Garmin catalog or the Garmin user guides that came as a PDF with all the core components I had, I got a rough diagram together of what I thought I needed. It was at this time that I realized I was probably in a little bit over my head and I needed some professional guidance, and I happened to catch a course by the Aircraft Electronics Association, I believe they're called AEA, out of a suburb out of Kansas City, Missouri. Near Garmin headquarters and certainly staffed by a lot of people very familiar with Garmin. The course was led by someone who has their own avionics shop out there and does a lot of wiring for people. It was an excellent course. I would say it's nearly a mandatory if you're choosing to do some of this myself. Therefore, it's going on the total list of costs. I won't include room and board or airfare because I don't know where you're coming from, but just keep that in mind when you're looking at doing this. If you wanted to take this on without going to the class, I would highly recommend finding some sort of supplemental information, whether that be an online course provided by EAA or some of the other reference materials out there. Another book that helped guide my electronic systems diagram, not so much the avionics, but the electronic systems diagram, was The Aeroelectric Connection by Bob Knuckles, and that guided a lot of the decisions that we'll talk about a little later on. Fresh off that course, I was ready to do some wiring, but first I had to update my schematic because there was some things that I had wired up incorrectly. And I wanted to create a supplemental piece to that schematic. And that supplemental piece is essentially an Excel spreadsheet that contained every single wire that I planned to put in the plane. While this seems a little bit extra, and often the things I do are a little bit extra, this wound up to be a huge benefit because it helped me understand just exactly which wire was going where. And I thought it would be a wonderful diagram to have, a wonderful chart to have, if I were to ever troubleshoot the system going forward. That is, if I have one end of a wire and I have that wire number, I know exactly where it's going and what it's doing. There was some unintended benefits of having this level of documentation, and we'll get into that in just a second. In addition to the wire list, I also had a list of my ground block and every terminal that was going into that and where it was coming from, and a list of my fuse panels and what each fuse was for, its amperage rating, and what wires were headed to it. This allowed for these 3 sheets to be all cross-referenced and hopefully provide a great view from a data-only standpoint, not a visual guide, but a data guide as to what was doing what in my panel. Now, at the same time, I was trying to plan the physical panel, where the boxes would align, and how long the wiring runs were. And you may remember that I threw what I called a ribbon party in my plane, where I started trying to replicate each wire run with a different colored ribbon. This soon turned into just a chaotic mess of wire within the plane, but not before it did provide some great insight as to how long these wiring runs were. I then fed that data back into my spreadsheet, which really gave me an idea as to how much wire I was going to need to order. One of the things that's been requested is that I share this information, and I'm willing to do that with some caveats, in that I have areas of my wiring diagram that aren't fully fleshed out. They're not fully completed. And it tends to be where you stray away from Garmin boxes into things like switches and fuse boxes and light boards, where I don't have quite 100% documentation of every wire. And there's sort of this gray line between power systems and avionics systems, and while the avionics systems was fully there, the power systems was very rough in that original schematic and the wiring charts that I created off of that. So keep that in mind when utilizing these, which is something I didn't have at the forefront of my mind when I started making wiring orders. I approach my wiring order much like you'd approach ordering carpet or flooring for your home, in that I thought I knew about what I needed. I had my diagram, I added about 20% for waste and cutting, and I placed an order. Except my blueprint for my home in this instance, or my plane, wasn't really complete, and therefore I wound up not quite getting as much wire as I needed right off the bat. And that's where, in my project, shipping costs skyrocketed. I spent, I think, a total of about $600 to $750 in shipping from places like Stein Aircraft, Spruce, and others. And that could easily be cut by about a third if you remove a sizable amount of the orders that I had to continually make to constantly replenish my supply of wire and connectors and things like that. Now, back to the ribbon party. The ribbon party, again, was helpful, but I have promised some insight as to what I would do differently, and that is certainly one of them. In that, I think I could have really simplified it to a twine party and just simply used a piece of twine for each connector itself and the bulk of wires running to that, versus trying to replicate each wire. Had I done this, I probably would have seen a little more clearly where I could have used about 6 inches more of wire in 2 spots and had about 12 inches too much wire in a few others. As a result, I've got a couple service loops that I don't think will ever really be necessary or utilized, and I've had to go the extra mile in getting those secured and out of the way. With my initial connectors, terminals, and wiring order in hand, I was ready to start planning this thing for real. Much like I learned in the class, by the Aircraft Electronics Association. I changed my tables into a wiring board, and I started making wiring runs. Now, you can't get very far without needing some tools, and tools here are expensive. I think in total, I'm about $1,000 deep in tools simply for the wiring itself. That doesn't include the rest of the tools required to make a plane, of course. A lot of people look at this portion of the budget as something that can be avoided, but I would urge some caution there. And it goes back to, for one example, the quotes originally provided by various avionics suppliers and what they detail they include and don't include. Meaning that for $8,000 or $12,000 or whatever you spend, you are going to get a full harness, but it's not going to necessarily include all the provisions for things like flaps or lighting, or perhaps ELTs or carbon monoxide detectors. Those are often included separately or a separate part of the quote and required to be installed separately by the builder. Now, if you don't have all the tools from building your avionics, you're going to wind up having to buy some of these crimpers, cutters, strippers, things like that, just to do a small job. And so you're not necessarily going to be able to avoid a full $1,000 tool budget, though I would say there are probably a few items that you could knock off the list. Now, back to the wire itself. And I know I'm jumping around a bit, bear with me. My initial wiring order was fairly complete, but not all the way. What I did is I took that spreadsheet that I mentioned I created, and I was able to sort it by wiring type, gauge, shielded or unshielded color, and get a total count of the number of feet added up from all of the wiring runs that utilize that to give me what should have been, had that been a complete list, a total number of feet required of each type of wire. This was incredibly effective in some areas. I got my stack of extra wire here. Don't worry, I'm not done wiring, so this isn't all waste, but a little bit of it probably will wind up that way. However, when it comes to CAN bus, it provides a perfect case study of my calculations versus what was ordered. I ordered 80 feet of CAN bus wire. According to my sheet, I needed, I believe, 65 feet. I should have wound up with 15 feet of extra CAN bus wire. And through some of that waste, that 15 or 20% I included, I wound up with exactly 7 feet of extra CAN bus wire at the end of running all of my CAN bus. Had everything worked that simply, I would have avoided a lot of cost and a lot of headache. And again, I want to tout the merits of an overly complex system I created here. Again, where it didn't serve me is where I had left a number of those wire runs off and had to go back and continually resupply wire. I think my initial wiring order was somewhere around $1,200, but at the end, I've spent just south of $2,000 on wire. Now, that includes $400 on CAN bus wire because I went with the expensive stuff versus what a lot of people do, which is use just a simple shielded 2-strand wire. $2,000 on wire sounds like an exceptionally large amount, and I would agree. And I do have some extra here that I could probably do without, though I think it's going to be good to have on hand. And again, I'm not done. I still have to run things like pitot heat wire out to the wings. I have to make one more wing extension, and there's a few other things I have to wire into the plane. In addition to wire, you're going to need some connectors and terminals. And no, I'm not talking about the expensive ones that Garmin sells you. Those are included in the base cost. What I'm talking about are all of the connectors you're going to need front of the firewall, or connecting your wings, or connecting your lights, or things like that. In my instance, I used Dutch connectors. They were a wonderful system. In addition to that, I bought an insanely expensive ground block that I later bemoaned that goes on my firewall, and I have utilized all gold-plated connectors, both male and female, in these various connections. As of now, connectors and terminals landing somewhere around $600. Again, you could probably save a little bit of money here. I have a drawer filled with ring terminals and things like that, butt connectors, some additional solder splices. However, these things have proven to be exceptionally handy to have on hand. Now, there are areas where they are arguably avionics or avionics adjacent, but not necessarily included in the quote you got from your avionics provider. Those items, a carbon monoxide detector, an ELT, a lighting system, probably not included in your avionics quote, but should be included in your electronics plan for your plane. I've separated those out as just additional components and put them into the overall budget so that you can see that they're there and figure out how you're going to approach those, and if you want to mentally remove them or not when trying to make the decision on how you're going to approach your system. Another avionics adjacent item that I've included are what I'm calling pneumatic items. These are the angle of attack, pitot, and static. I didn't spend a ton here, but I spent more than I needed. I originally bought a kit for angle of attack pitot-static from Stein that was for a Garmin system that proved to be a total disaster. The connectors would not fit the Garmin system. They didn't work for my plane. I wound up scavenging what I could and buying the rest piecemeal. If you wanted, you could probably cut this line item in the budget in half if you approached it a little smarter than I did. These are, again, things that are not likely to be included in your quote from your Avionics panel provider. In fact, 2 of the quotes that I received had a disclaimer saying that they did not include any provisions for a pitot-static system. One area where I wound up saving money over most, probably the only area that I wound up saving money over most people, is the choice to go with a fused panel versus circuit breakers or something like a VPX or vertical power system. This is another area I don't want to wade too far into the merits of and drawbacks to these various systems. I will just say that I went with fuses. It works for me and my panel, and as a result, I do believe I saved a little bit of money. Regardless, they should be included in the budget, and this is an area where you may want to, when planning your system, figure out if you need to fatten that area up a little bit. After the harness is created and you got to go get it into the plane and plug all these boxes in, you need somewhere to put everything. And that is where I get into what I called fabrication. As anybody who watched the channel saw, I had a variety of different test panels. I created my own center stack supports, as well as 2 different supports for my fuse panels and my remote radio. And there's a decent amount of custom fab. On top of all of this, my final panel went out to a custom water jet cutting and powder coating facility, and then we had the cost of the labels and everything else on top of that. I have included some of this because a lot of the quotes that I received included a powder coated and laser etched panel. And I think if we're comparing apples to apples here, it's only fair. Though I will note, I spent way more money on fabrication than I needed to, probably 2 to 3 times as much as I had to if I had just had a solid plan going forward. However, for me, a lot of this was very iterative and moving things around in sort of a trial and error approach that I simply couldn't do without some of these intermediate steps. Therefore, I'm throwing it all into the fabrication portion of the budget, though again, this is an area where if you wanted, you could likely save a sizable amount of money. So all that said, and this stings, I think we're over $9,000 when summing everything up. And you're going, Ryan, it was only $8,000 for somebody to do all this work for you. It was, but again, as I've noted, I have included a lot in this that others have not. In fact, I've included just about everything to get to the state that I am at now, which is working lights, working pitot-static, a fully operational panel with labels and powder coating installed in the plane. There's a lot of connectors and things that I don't believe would be included in those quotes. Again, most of those quotes coming with some sort of disclaimer stating just that. There is also a huge number of items here that I believe you will be purchasing regardless. And so if we do some math here in removing some of those, you will be purchasing wire, tools. Some of these components are necessary regardless. If we pull those out of the budget and approach this in a little more rational-minded, less all-inclusive state, I think you will find that I spent probably closer to $4,000 on something that would cost you $8,000 to $12,000 from a panel provider. That makes me feel a little better, but that doesn't necessarily make you feel any better. Is it worth the $2,000 to $4,000 savings over having a professional do it yourself? Arguably, they would do a nicer job on many of the things that I struggled with. For example, the aforementioned wiring lengths issue. They have the experience. They provide a very neat and tidy system. I've seen it. They're beautiful panels, and I don't want to knock the work or the services that they provide. There is definite value there, but that's why I can't make the decision for you. Because for me, it wasn't just the savings. It's the fact that I know this panel inside and out. I can troubleshoot it. If I want to add something, it's not super intimidating for me to go and start ripping things out of the panel and putting things back in. I'm comfortable working on it and again, troubleshooting every facet of the system. It's also a bit of pride. When I set out to make a plane, I wanted to make just about everything. Aside from two things, I won't do upholstery and I won't do paint. We've all seen my work in the primer booth and it's not good. I didn't expect this to come out with a clear-cut winner. In fact, I expected my costs to be substantially higher. I was a little surprised that there was any savings at all with the amount of waste that I had at points. But there it is. That's it as succinctly as I can. That's the guts of wiring your own panel, the costs associated with it, and hopefully answering some of the questions that you may have. Now, if I haven't answered all of those questions, please write them in the comments. I'll be paying attention, answering everything that I can. And if you haven't seen the series up to this point on wiring these things, go ahead and go back a couple episodes and take a look at all the work involved. That may, better than this episode, help guide your decision on if you want to take this on or not. As always, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you shortly on Ryan Flies. There is a lot to share. Over the past few weeks, I have been building a ton, and I am very excited to show it all to you. As noted, files are available on my website at ryanflies.com/avionics-rundown. Here you will also catch a blog where I explain a little bit of how I've derived the numbers like waste and what was spent, a few of the omissions, and overall just a general idea of why I put this together. I encourage you to go there and review, as well as provide any feedback that you would like. Thank you so much for being a part of this build, all of the wonderful feedback you've provided, and thank you for watching Ryan Flies.